New payment levels would be determined based in part on MDS data, and we'll be looking at those actual payment levels only beginning in the latter quarter of this year. So we're still months away from really digging into specific payment models in an iterative fashion with live data. Am I saying that correctly? Reporting begins in the payment improvement process before payment improvements are implemented. So before we hold a provider accountable or begin paying in a different way, we begin reporting to providers how that payment would affect you based on historical data. We've done that with our medical episodes, where we begin about a quarter in advance to report specific data to providers about their practice and about how they would fare under the new payment model. And then we continue to provide those reports on an ongoing basis once the performance periods, once we go live with the new payment models. And that's, as you know, again, true now for 5 medical episodes, 4 more. We begin the regulatory process within the next business day or 2 or 3, and those will go live in October. So this is consistent with the rest of our process. We promulgate those changes. It'll require regulatory change in our payments. And we anticipate that the new payment models and long-term service and supports would be effective fiscal year 15. Would that be fiscal year 15? Yes, the middle of, going into effect the middle of next year. So we're working pretty far in advance. We also know that, especially in the case of the larger institutional providers, your planning window is also pretty long. So we're trying to provide as much lead time as possible and be as transparent as possible with at least our intended direction.
So our current residents are going to be reassessed by this new process. And actually they've already been reassessed, correct? Through the company that's calibrating the MDS and knowing where our residents fall?
I think you were just asking a question about what happens to existing residents in terms of assessment, and I think the simple answer is it hasn't been discussed yet. So this is an area we would appreciate your input and thoughts. It's along the very long amongst the very, very long list of things we need to address in the next few months.
Payments are hopefully to be prospectively determined in periodic installments. Oh, look. Someone thought of this. Assess the need. This could have been a lot easier. This is walking a patient through the process. Determine the setting of care. An episode budget. What is an episode budget? It's an upfront payment at a fixed level for a specific level of need. And by the way, this is for community-based and institutional care. Select a provider. Then, of course, receive services, provide them. Will payment be on a monthly or weekly basis? That's yet to be determined. We want your input. We expect that some providers will be better able to handle monthly payments than others. But that we haven't decided. Want your input. Outcomes are determined and levels of need reassessed, and we return to the budgeting process to determine the level of need for the next period of time. Questions about or comments about that process? It's sort of implicit in what we've been discussing, which is risk-adjusted payments to match the level of need and payments that relate to outcomes and quality. So we are in the process of re-examining, Jim brought this up, re-examining the absolute metrics relative to reimbursement. And doing that demonstrates an opportunity to align payment and quality. The measures that we use to come to that conclusion are continue to be under review. We were told early on not to use the 5-star rating, so we've gone down a level to look at the components of the 5-star rating in part. And what these charts show is that, again, always with level of need, or in this case, level of occurrence of a good or bad thing, how does payment relate? And the answer is not at all. So whether we measure per diems by pressure ulcers, catheters left in the bladder, individuals lost too much weight, or percentage with the urinary tract infection, and then look at whether our payments happen to correspond to quality measured in any of those ways, or an aggregation of them, they don't. So it would not matter how we come up with a 3, 5, 7, or 8-star system, and no matter how we weight it, when you put the data on the left together, it will always show no correlation at all to what we pay. So we do not pay according to quality. We do not pay according to need. Both are kind of the core tenets of the payment improvements that we're engaged in. So what might be done about that? Here is a straw man suggestion, which you should by no means assume is where we'll end up. But we feel like it's our job to make suggestions so that we can have a constructive conversation in the policy process. So we're looking at a combination of comparisons across providers and comparisons to an absolute level of performance. Comparisons even to a provider from one time frame to the next. Improvement matters. And one of the challenges or opportunities or just processes of payment design is deciding whether it is movement that's to be paid for, that is improvement and change over time, or whether it is the achievement of an absolute standard that should drive payment, or a mix of the two. In the patient-centered medical home, for example, we're going to recommend a combination of the two. I think that's what you're going to see in this model as well. So process-based measures of outcomes, if providers were measured against those, rated on 3 performance evaluation methods, client outcome measures as well. The first comparison would be performance relative to peers. In the top 5%, 10%, pick a number. The second would be historical performance. What is the second point?
Historical performance relative to yourself.
I'm sorry. Improvement. A verb would be helpful there. So historical performance, I'm sorry, I'm giving you a hard time. It's myself I'm giving a hard time. Historical performance ensures, so this is the improvement issue. This is rewarding change by some percentage or some absolute amount. Absolute performance then is not a comparison to your peer. It's not a comparison to you last year. It's a comparison to an absolute standard. So those 3 types of performance. And here are, the beginning of a classification system that draws on all 3 kinds of performance and orders them. So what if there were these 4 categories of performance: distinctive, commendable, acceptable, and unacceptable. Those of you who are not familiar with the medical side of this, the episodes have acceptable, commendable, and what's in the middle? And then, unacceptable is at the high end. So they have 3. Distinctive is the best performance relative to peers. Commendable, it meets base requirements. That's an absolute level of performance. And shows improvement. Acceptable meets the base performance, but does not show improvement. And unacceptable is none of the above. No improvement, not base. Or actually, I'm sorry, it's just not meeting base. So just as with the medical episodes, what this suggests is there really is a minimum level of performance for components of payment that relate to performance, by the way. There is a minimal level of performance, and if you're not below that, it's unacceptable, and there's really no qualification for quality-related incentive. And then in order, the next three: base performance, base and improvement, and then an absolute level of performance relative to peers, and of course, exceeding the base. Maybe that's what we should say next time.
I mean, I feel
a
like
suggestion to get the conversation started.
I feel like what you're saying, though, with the slides, all of these say pretty definite statements at the top.
Good point, and I think that's
And you're saying that it hasn't
something
been
we could.
decided. This implies otherwise.
Let me just suggest, in the end, it's not us that decides. So it couldn't have been decided. That's a public policy process.
This says will reward providers.
Fair enough. You've made a good point, and we will improve the accuracy of those statements.
Thank you.
To something like, here's a suggestion, let's think about that. I'm actually very happy to level set on that point. There is always a question. The second state I've been in, not my first rodeo, by far not my first public meeting or process. There is always a question of whether the person most responsible and accountable for a program makes a suggestion or simply responds. So far, I've not been in a public process that adds up to a formula. It's just kind of a mismatch between public process and math. So for better or worse, we're going to try to make suggestions, but this is tough stuff. And in the end, what we're trying to make sure is that our incentives match what ought to happen. We know that isn't the case now, and making it right is a very involved process. So here are a consistent set of nursing facility quality measures. This is just descriptive that we've observed or used across the nation. We'd like your input on which are right for Arkansas, not just tonight, but in the future. Falling in the categories of staffing, nursing home inspection, clinical quality indicators, consumer satisfaction, person-centered care, others that you might suggest. You see on the right some that have been suggested by at least some nursing facility providers. We don't speak for nursing facilities, but that's what we've heard so far, and we're asking for your input. So here they are, the first: nurse and other direct care staffing levels. Staff retention, turnover, use of poor or contract staff. A key issue for any measure is how you know. Where's the data come from? Does it require new data submission and reporting by providers? In medical episodes, in some cases, that has happened where we do ask our providers to input new data to us solely for the purpose of a new payment methodology, either for risk adjustment or for quality. In this case, I believe we're already collecting data like this. Staff satisfaction would be another, with work environment, management relations with other staff, teamwork, organizational culture. It would take a survey to do that. Do you want us to pay based on staff satisfaction? I assume there's some relationship somewhere in the literature that suggests a relationship between patient outcomes and staff satisfaction, but that's a rating system. That's not the same as a concrete or perfectly objective data point, and that's the judgments that we're going to need to make collectively. Nursing home inspection, that's Carol Shockley's Office of Long-Term Care. Regulatory compliance in clinical care, resident quality of life, resident rights, dietary services, physical environment, clinical quality indicators, nursing home quality indicators such as pressure sores, physical or chemical restraints. We've seen some of these already on previous pages, and decline or improvement in activities of daily living. Minimum data set is a source for those. We would like your input, so we're specifically asking for input on quality measures that should be included in the payment methodology. What matters most? Which data sources can we rely on objectively and attach payment to without tremendous error or bias? We want your suggestions.